I know the difference between a house that's been lived in and a house that's just been kept. One has scuffs on the baseboards and a drawer in the kitchen that never closes all the way, and a spot on the back porch where the paint blistered because somebody left a grill too close to the wall. The other one is clean, polished, empty in the way that matters. I spent 34 years building things for other people. Custom homes, mostly. The kind with crown molding and walk in closets and 3-car garages that families fill up with bicycles and holiday decorations and all the ordinary clutter of a life being lived. I knew what a real home looked like from the inside out, the bones of it, the weight bearing parts, the places where a hairline crack meant something serious was coming. I should have applied that same knowledge to my own family. My name is not important. What I am is a 63-year-old man who spent the better part of a decade watching people I loved turn slowly into strangers, and who spent too long convincing himself that what he was seeing wasn't real. I was a contractor. I could spot a problem in a foundation from 50 feet away, but inside my own house, I kept telling myself the cracks were cosmetic. My wife, I'll call her by what she became to me, not what she once was, had been pulling away for years before I admitted it, not in the dramatic way you read about. No screaming, no accusations, no obvious distance, just a slow, quiet rearrangement of priorities. The kind that happens so gradually, you don't notice until one day you reach for someone and realize they've been gone a long time already. My daughter had married a man named Sterling about 6 years ago. Sterling was the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than most people's used cars and talked about his network, the way other men talked about their friends. He worked in commercial real estate, or said he did. He had opinions about wine and restaurants and neighborhoods, and he expressed all of them loudly and often. My daughter thought he was extraordinary. I thought he was a man who had figured out that other people's money was easier to spend than his own. What I didn't know then, what I would only understand later, was that Sterling had been borrowing, not from banks, from me, through my daughter, through my wife, through a quiet, coordinated system of requests and favors and emergencies that had been running for years while I signed checks and refinanced and told myself this was just what family did. My wife would come to me with a soft voice and a specific number. The furnace at their place needed replacing. Sterling had a deal coming in that required bridge financing. Just for 60 days, I promise. My daughter needed a medical procedure the insurance wouldn't cover. Could we help? Of course we could help. We had the money. I had built a good business. I had done well. And you helped, family. I helped. I helped until the morning I woke up at 5:30 and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and did the math in my head and realized I had moved, in the past 4 years, just over $240,000 toward my daughter and Sterling's life, not as loans in any formal sense, as help, as love, I had told myself, as what you do. That morning, I didn't say anything. I got up, made coffee, drove to a job site in the next county, and spent the day watching men work, and I thought. That was November. By the following August, things had shifted in ways I couldn't ignore. My wife had started having dinner with my daughter and Sterling on nights she told me she was with her book club. I found this out not through snooping, but through coincidence. I ran into a woman from her book club at the hardware store, and she mentioned they hadn't seen much of my wife lately. I filed that away. Sterling had started showing up at family events, Sunday dinners, the occasional holiday, with a kind of ownership energy that I couldn't quite name at the time. He would make decisions, where we would eat, what we would watch. He would speak for my daughter, finish her sentences, wave off her opinions with a little laugh that everyone pretended not to notice, and my wife would laugh too, lightly, accommodatingly, in a way she had stopped laughing with me years before. My daughter had changed, not all at once and not obviously. But the girl who used to call me on her way home from work to talk about nothing in particular, the one who had my mother's laugh and who cried at the same kind of movies I did, that person was somewhere underneath a woman who now talked about Sterling's vision and what we've decided and who. looked at me sometimes with a careful, measuring expression that I didn't recognize. I noticed. I didn't speak. I kept building other people's houses and paying other people's bills and telling myself the cracks were cosmetic. Then came the night of Sterling's birthday party. He was turning 40. My daughter had rented out the back room of a restaurant in the city. The kind of place with no prices on the menu and a sommelier who makes you feel vaguely stupid for not knowing what you don't know. The party was a Saturday. I had confirmed I would be there. My wife had been talking about it for 2 weeks, about the dress she'd bought, about the gift they'd selected, about how important it was to Sterling that the people he loved were there. I was there in the sense that I was getting ready. I was in the bathroom. Ty half nodded when I felt it. I've heard people describe chest pain in different ways. Some say pressure, some say tightening. What I felt was more like something fundamental shifting, like a beam giving way inside a wall. A wrongness that moved up my left arm and told me, with a certainty that needed no interpretation, that something was very seriously wrong. I made it to the bedroom floor. I had enough presence of mind to reach my phone on the nightstand. I dialed 911. I told them what was happening and gave them the address. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay still. I did both. My wife was downstairs. She had already called a car. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I know because the dispatcher told me the time when they walked through the door. One of them was young, maybe 25, with a calm voice and fast hands. He put leads on my chest and spoke to me in even, unhurried sentences while his partner moved around the room. They had me on a gurney and out the door in under 4 minutes. As they were loading me into the ambulance, I saw my wife standing on the front steps. She had her coat on, her purse over her shoulder, her phone in her hand. She watched them put me in the ambulance. She did not come with me in the ambulance. She did not come with me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to find a way to explain what I felt in that moment, and I don't think I ever will. Not because it was so terrible, though it was, but because it was so clarifying, like a fever breaking, like a finally seeing the load-bearing wall that had never been there. At the hospital, the cardiologist, a steady-handed woman who had seen everything and was moved by very little, told me I had experienced a significant cardiac event, a blockage. They were going to keep me overnight, possibly longer, and they would need to do a procedure in the morning. She asked if there was someone she should call. I gave her my wife's number. She stepped out. She came back 10 minutes later with an expression I read immediately as professional neutrality over something else. She told me she had spoken to my wife. She said my wife had said that she was glad to hear I was stable and that she would check in tomorrow, but that tonight was a significant event for the family and she hoped I understood. The cardiologist said this in a careful, even voice, and then looked at me for a moment before asking if there was someone else she could call. I said no. I said I was fine. She nodded in the particular way of someone who does not agree, but will respect your decision. She adjusted something on my IV line and left me in the room. The room was quiet. There was a window with a view of a parking structure. The monitor beeped at intervals that eventually became a kind of company. I lay there in the dark and I thought about load-bearing walls. I thought about what my wife had said. Tonight was a significant event for the family. She was at Sterling's birthday party. I was in a cardiac unit, and Sterling's birthday was the significant event for the family. I didn't sleep much that night, but I thought clearly, maybe more clearly than I had in years. The procedure the next morning was what they call a stent placement routine, I was told, though the word routine feels odd when applied to someone threading a wire into your heart. I was awake for it, aware when it was over. The cardiologist came back and told me it had gone well and that I needed rest. My wife arrived the next afternoon, a Sunday, around 2 o'clock. She came with my daughter. Sterling was not with them, which I noted. My daughter hugged me with an energy that felt practiced. My wife sat in a chair by the bed and asked how I was feeling and whether the nurses had been attentive and whether I needed anything from home. I told her I was fine. I told them both I was fine. What I did not tell them was that I had already made 3 phone calls that morning, one to my attorney, one to my financial advisor, one to a private investigator I had used once before to verify a contractor who'd given me a suspiciously low bid on a job. That last call was the one I was least sure about. But by the time I made it, I was sure enough. I spent 11 days in the hospital. During that time, my wife visited 4 times. My daughter visited twice. Sterling sent a fruit basket with a card that said, "Wishing you a speedy recovery," in handwriting that was not his own. I kept the card. I set it on the tray table where I could see it. During those 11 days, the private investigator I had hired, a methodical, unimpressive looking man named Aldous, who turned out to be extraordinarily good at his job, began pulling on threads, and what he found, slowly, over the following weeks, was a picture I had been painting myself for years without realizing it. Sterling had never closed the deals he described. The commercial real estate work was real in the loosest sense. He held a license. He had a company name. He occasionally completed a transaction. But the income it generated was inconsistent and far smaller than he projected. The life they lived, the apartment in the city, the car my daughter drove, the vacations, the restaurant bills, the watch, was financed largely by a combination of my money and credit that Sterling had been accumulating in ways that weren't always straightforward. Aldous also found something I hadn't asked him to look for. Over a period of about 2 years, Sterling had been submitting what appeared to be inflated invoices to a commercial property management company he did business with. The overcharges were not enormous by any single transaction, but they added up. And the property management company, it turned out, had a compliance department that had recently begun noticing. I passed what Aldous found along to my attorney. I was home from the hospital for 6 days before I did anything visible. I moved carefully. I walked slowly. I did my cardiac rehab exercises in the morning. I ate the bland food the cardiologist had recommended. I was, to all appearances, a man recovering quietly from a serious health event. On the seventh day, I drove to my bank. I met with a manager I had known for 11 years. I had 3 accounts that my wife was a signatory on: a joint checking account, a savings account, and a money market account that held the bulk of our liquid assets. I did not close these accounts. What I did was methodical and legal, and carefully reviewed by my attorney before I acted. I transferred significant funds to a separate account in my name only. I changed the primary contact information. I reviewed every automatic payment, every linked account, every card attached to those funds. I also contacted my insurance broker. I reviewed the policy on the house my daughter and Sterling were living in, a house I owned and had been renting to them at below market rate, as a favor I had never formalized. I sent a certified letter informing them that the rental arrangement would be transitioning to market rate, effective 60 days from the date of the letter, and that I would need a signed lease agreement. I did not tell my wife any of this. She had been sleeping in the guest room since I came home from the hospital, which she framed as concern for my arrest, and which I understood as something else entirely. We ate dinner together sometimes. We spoke pleasantly. She asked how I was feeling, and I said I was getting stronger. Sterling called me once during this period. He asked how I was doing, and I said I was doing well. He said he was sorry he hadn't been able to get to the hospital, and I said I understood. He said they were all really glad I pulled through, and I said that made 2 of us. He laughed a little uncertainly, and we ended the call. It was the last real conversation we had. The certified letter about the rental arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, my daughter was in my living room, sitting very straight in the chair across from me, telling me that I had made a mistake and that this wasn't how family treated each other, and that Sterling was working on something big and the timing was impossible. And did I really want to do this? I listened to the whole thing. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said I thought it was reasonable to formalize an arrangement that had been informal for too long. I said I hoped they'd have no trouble with the new terms. She left without saying goodbye. My wife came to find me in the kitchen afterward. She had been home. She had heard. She stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression that was trying to be concerned and landing closer to calculating. She said she thought we should talk about what I was doing. She said that Sterling had been going through a difficult time and that the family needed to pull together, not push apart. I asked her where she had been when I was loaded into an ambulance. She started to answer, and I raised my hand gently and said I wasn't asking for an explanation. I was asking her to think about what pulling together had meant to her, and whether she thought it had meant the same thing to me. She didn't answer. She went to bed. 3 weeks later, Aldous gave me his final report. The picture it painted was complete and, in its way, almost elegant in how long it had been hidden. Sterling had, over the prior 4 years, moved money through my daughter's personal accounts, money that originated from me in various forms in a pattern that suggested he was using those transfers to make his own financial statements appear more viable than they were. It wasn't simple fraud, it was layered. Some of it was probably not legally actionable, but the invoice inflation scheme was a different matter. My attorney had already been in contact with the property management company's legal team. They had been building their own case. My documentation, the records Aldous had compiled, the bank transfers, the timeline, filled in gaps they hadn't been able to close on their own. I did not press charges. I didn't have to. The property management company did. Sterling was arrested on a Thursday morning in early spring. I found out when my daughter called me, crying in a way that cut through everything. That old familiar crying I recognized from when she was small, and the world that hurt her in some new way. I sat with the phone and I let her cry, and I said I was sorry. I meant it, not for Sterling, for her, for the part of all this she hadn't chosen, even if she hadn't chosen to see it clearly either. My wife filed for divorce 6 weeks after Sterling's arrest. I had already spoken to my attorney about this possibility. The process was not painless, but it was not complicated. The assets had been organized in a way that reflected reality, what I had built, what I had earned, what had been mine. The house she wanted to stay in was mine. I let her buy me out at a fair price, which required her to take a mortgage for the first time in her adult life. I thought about what that meant. I didn't take satisfaction in it the way I might have expected to. I just thought about it. The rental house went on the market in the fall. Sterling was out on bail and they had moved into an apartment I knew nothing about. My daughter called me occasionally. The calls were different now, shorter, more careful, with the quality of someone feeling for solid ground. I answered everyone. I didn't punish her for the call she hadn't made. The one I kept thinking about was the call she made from the hospital parking lot on the night of the ambulance. Aldous had found a detail I hadn't asked for and almost wished he hadn't. In the early hours of that Saturday night, after my wife had arrived at the restaurant and been told what had happened, my daughter had stepped outside and called a friend of hers for 45 minutes. I don't know what they talked about. I don't need to know. I just know that during that 45 minutes, I was in a hospital room by myself, looking at a parking structure, and my daughter was on the phone. I don't say this to wound her. I say it because it's the truth. And I've spent too much of my life decorating over the truth with something that looked better. My cardiologist cleared me for normal activity in the spring, about 8 months after the event. I went back to work, lighter work, consulting mostly, reviewing plans, walking job sites. I found I liked the walking. I had a foreman I trusted named Philip who ran the day-to-day and who called me when things got complicated and handled most things before they had to. There's a house I'm building now in the hill country, about 2 hours from where I've always lived. I designed it myself. It's not large, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in. It has a room with south-facing windows that I am going to use for nothing in particular for a while and see what it becomes. The bones of it are good. I know that for certain. I put them there myself. My daughter came to see me last month for the first time since the divorce was final. We sat on the porch of the house I'm renting while the new one gets finished. And she brought coffee from a place in town that makes it the right way, and we sat for a while without saying much. She asked if I was happy. I said I was getting there, which was the truest answer I had. She asked if I blamed her. I thought about the ambulance. I thought about the 45-minute phone call. I thought about all the mornings I had signed checks and told myself it was love. I told her that blame had never been the point, that what I had wanted all along was simply to be seen, to matter, in the plain and ordinary way that people who love each other are supposed to matter, to be the kind of thing someone runs toward when it breaks, not away from. She cried a little. I let her, and then we drank the coffee while it was still warm and watched the light change over the hills, and it was, in its quiet and complicated way, a beginning. I know the difference between a house that's been lived in and a house that's just been kept. I'm building the kind you live in. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet, where I come home from the hospital, accept the fruit basket, eat the bland food, and tell myself that family is complicated and people make mistakes and love is supposed to be unconditional. I know that version well. I lived inside it for the better part of a decade. What I understand now, sitting on a porch I actually want to be on, is that unconditional love and unconditional tolerance are not the same thing. I confused them for years, and that confusion cost me not just money, though the money was real, but something harder to name. A kind of self respect that goes quiet when you keep overriding what you know to be true. What my wife did on the night of the ambulance was not a lapse in judgment, it was a conclusion. It was the end of a long sentence that had been building for years. And if I'm being honest with myself, and I've decided I'm going to be, from here on, I had seen the words forming long before she spoke them. I just didn't want to read them. That's not wisdom. That's the opposite of it. Real clarity. The kind that actually protects you, requires you to look at what's in front of you and call it by its right name, even when the right name is painful. Sterling was not a mystery. He was a pattern I had seen before in business. A man who moved fast, talked louder than he delivered, and understood instinctively that generosity can be exploited if the generous person needs badly enough to believe it's love. I had spotted that pattern in contractors, in subcontractors, in vendors who padded invoices and smiled warmly when they handed them over. I knew what it looked like. I just decided, because he was family, that what I was seeing must be something else. That was a failure of judgment, and it was mine. But here's what I also know. Recognizing that is not the same as carrying it forever. The intelligence to see clearly has to be paired with something harder. The willingness to act on what you see, even when acting means loss, even when it means grief, even when it means sitting in a rented house while the home you actually want is still being built. That willingness is a form of courage that nobody prepares you for. You don't find it in a book. You find it mostly in the moments when staying small feels safer than telling the truth. My daughter asked me if I blamed her. I said blame wasn't the point, and I meant that. But I also meant something I didn't say out loud, which is that the people we love are capable of making choices we don't deserve, and forgiving them for those choices does not require pretending they didn't happen. It requires something more demanding than forgiveness, actually. It requires accuracy. Seeing the person as they are, not as you need them to be, and deciding from that honest place what you're willing to build going forward. The house in the hill country has good bones. I put them there. I know what holds and what doesn't. And I'm done laying foundations on ground that was never solid to begin with. That's not bitterness. That's just finally knowing what I know.